Let's get kicking. Hey guys, welcome to the 37th episode of Let's Talk Comics, where myself and another co-host in the comic book community discuss one of the many facets of the storytelling medium that is comics. Whether it be creators, stories, constructs, or adaptations, we hit it all this week. Of course, I am joined or rejoined by my partner in crime, the Canadian Cape Crusader, Comic Boom. My man, how are you today?
I'm doing good. Just came back from work, just chillaxing and ready to talk about moral centers and superheroes.
Yeah, of course. So as Boom alluded to here, today's discussion topic is the moral compass of the modern day superhero. And, you know, it really stemmed out of our last conversation that we did on Sunday. That was the biggest letdowns of comics. And, you know, I think right then and there, I was like, oh, man, we could sidebar this for another entire conversation. And the more Boom and I kind of discussed it behind closed doors, the more we realized this is a huge topic, because oftentimes the central thrust of a character's motives are entirely surrounded by their moral compass. And the more we talk about it, the more we convince ourselves of that. So yeah, it's certainly interesting. And I think that the first big question that we need to ask in relation to our topic is, how are we going to define morality for the sake of this conversation? Boom, I know you did some thorough research and we came up with some answers, but for the sake of this conversation, how are we defining morality?
Well, in the context of any character, it's how a character decides what is right and wrong. What does the character think is right or wrong, and how do they act accordingly? You know, on the basis of their moral makeup, are they good or bad? What actions do they think are good? What actions do they think are bad, and why? And do they act according to what, you know, are they consistent with what the writer establishes their moral compass to be? I mean, right or wrong, I don't, at the end of the day, a character can be a fantastic character, whether they're jerks or good guys or bad guys, as long as we have some familiarity with whatever their moral compass is. If we understand that character, we can better experience that character and better appreciate the story, even if we don't like the character.
Right. Yeah, and there's something to be said about that, because in storytelling, it's not always the most likable character that's the most interesting. There's a very clear divide here. And I was actually just talking to you specifically about how I just watched the Scorsese film Raging Bull, and how the protagonist, from about 15% of the film in and onward, is very unlikable, but he's interesting to follow. So with that being said, I was able to sit down for another hour and 45 minutes and be engaged with that movie. And that same kind of principle still applies to comic books. And it's really interesting because when you perspectivize the concept of morality, you get into some really muddy waters, right? Because every character and every person, but for the sake of this conversation, these iconic comic book characters will structure their moral compass around what they think is right. And what they think is right isn't always necessarily right. So, I think last night we kind of brainstormed a couple characters that kind of represent different categories of moral compasses, right? We have a rigid moral compass, a fluid moral compass, and an undefined moral compass. So I think, just starting from the top here, you can have characters like Superman, who's very rigid in his moral compass, arguably the most just character in all of comic books. He makes the right decisions 9.999 times out of 10. And it's very sturdy. He doesn't compromise in that way because of his sense of morality. And in the same vein, you have somebody like Frank Castle, who is, for all intents and purposes, the polar opposite of Superman, and yet his moral code is so rigid that he is willing to kill anybody who gets in the way of his moral code. So, kind of discussing those two characters, Boom, how would you put that? Like, how would you shape that, right? Like, how, or I guess I'm not wording myself well.
I think I know what you're asking. How I would shape it is that it's very interesting that I think it says something about humanity that when you have a very rigid moral code on the side of being a vigilante, where you're choosing lethal force, it's interesting that I think the Punisher is perceived as having better stories and is more interesting because he's more dark. And humanity, comic book readers, we seem to have a fascination with darker characters, more so than characters that are on the side of angels like Superman. Because Superman, I don't think it's any coincidence that Superman has very often been criticized, regardless of who writes him, Bendis, as being a boring character because he's too perfect. Wonder Woman, it's the same thing. Wonder Woman is thought to be preachy sometimes. Often certain writers write Wonder Woman, she comes across as preachy and a little bit too perfect. And when you have that type of rigid moral code, you can still be interesting, but the challenge is how do you make that character interesting? If the moral code is too rigid, then sometimes you might lose the audience at some point, because if the character becomes too predictable, well, then that can be a good thing, because we can say that we're close to the character, we understand the character, but at the same time, you don't want to get into a situation where you want to keep the ideas fresh and the story fresh. So how do you keep telling new Punisher stories that aren't just him killing bad guys? How do you shake it up? Same with Superman. How do you make his strict moral code? How do you challenge somebody who has a strict moral code? And I think that I think that's why, and I think this is a good segue in a general sense, the difference between DC and Marvel characters, because DC characters have traditionally been perceived as having a stricter moral code, generally speaking, because they're the iconic characters, mythological, a little bit more godlike, as opposed to the Marvel characters are traditionally the on the street characters, the view from the street. Their morality is a little bit more flexible and they're more real, and so they're more flawed. And it's that Stan Lee, how he revolutionized comic book storytelling by introducing the flaw. Better to have a diamond with a flaw than a pebble without. DC characters are like the pebbles without flaws, perfect, always doing the right thing. Marvel comes along and Peter Parker has all these problems, and that ill-defined or that flexible moral center can sometimes create more interest in readership.
No, you're absolutely right. And there's a reason why I wore this guy's shirt today, because I think he's probably one of the most morally complex characters in comics, specifically Daredevil. And regarding to Marvel, I think he is probably even Marvel's most morally complex character, because intentions are largely good, but the way that he operates on his intentions are not always the case. And even in earlier Daredevil stories, even in the scripts of the great Frank Miller, he literally tries to destroy his girlfriend so that she'd be desperate enough to marry him, which I still think is a little bit weird, but it all goes to show, and it in ways translates to Daredevil in modern day, maybe not not in such a kooky way as that, but it does translate. And it puts into perspective as well how faith affects your moral compass, right? Because faith often defines folks' morality. That's kind of the blueprint for how people operate and for how they determine whether or not something is inherently good or not. And Matt Murdock in particular, being of the Catholic faith, has this obligation that he feels the need to act on in terms of being a vigilante and in executing vigilante justice. But he always comes to conflict with himself internally on how to do it, right? He knows that his end goals are the right thing, but he doesn't know the right way to execute it. And those types of internal conflicts, juxtaposed against his external physical conflicts and whatever other emotional conflicts may be in his world, are arguably what makes him such an interesting character because of that struggle.
I agree. And just to build on what you're saying, And I did a review of Soul Finder, Douglas Ernst independent graphic novel, and he dealt with the theme there of faith. And the lead character there was Father Patrick Redder, and I looked into different definitions of faith, and one definition of faith is belief in action. And when you think of a moral center as, what does the character think is right or wrong, and how do they act accordingly? And it's what does the character believe, and are the character's actions consistent with what they believe? The greater the consistency, the more understanding you will have of that character. And that's why Daredevil has traditionally been considered one of the best written stories. There's something about the character of Daredevil, and even Batman, that every writer that writes Batman or Daredevil, they seem to write good stories. I often find that, if you take a writer's career, if a writer has a high point in their career and they've written Daredevil at some point, usually their high point is when they've written Daredevil. There's something about the character of Daredevil, and I think it's because of his moral center, his moral compass, that it's easy to define, and it's great stories seem to come from it, because it seems to be something where it inspires great stories, and that consistency between that belief in action. And so often we have new characters where some of the newer characters fail, and where some writers fail is that I think they confuse faith with lifestyle. And just because you have an active lifestyle doesn't mean you have faith. Just because you're mouthy and you're a smart ass, and you go and you work out a lot, and you have an active lifestyle, and that you might make the character do this or do that. What's the character believe? Just making a character engage in action, that doesn't create faith in the character. That's not belief in action. That's just a character running around being active. And I think we live in a day and age, especially with the comic book culture war and identity politics. I think that there's this confusion that somehow, well, what's my lifestyle? Well, we confuse, well, if the character is gay, somehow that's supposed to make the character interesting. No, if a character is gay, that doesn't tell me what the character believes. That doesn't tell me what the moral compass is of that character is. It just tells me their orientation. And I think there's a tendency sometimes if we criticize a character like that, we're not criticizing the orientation. We're just saying, look, tell me what the character believes in beyond the surface, and whether or not they act upon that belief. And I think that distinction is very important. And I think that lies at the heart of the dispute that we hear far too much of course, between SJWism and Comicsgate. And I think it's unfortunate, because I think that if you look at it from a breakdown like this, focusing on the moral compass, I don't think that the sides need to be so far apart.
Yeah, and the thing is that there's an awkward subjection of the word morality to folks' bias, right? There's a connotation for the word moral, right? Like, you are a moral person, I am a moral person. People assume that means that they are inherently good people. And it's weird, because at least for the sake of this conversation, the word moral really describes kind of somebody's pathology of thought and how they approach the rationale for why they do what they do. And it puts into question that connotation behind the word moral, because if you're looking specifically at the comic book culture war, both sides think that they're good, and they would call themselves moral on the grounds that they think that means that they're good people. And I'm sure many people on both sides are. But it just puts into question how people kind of take the word and the context of morality and reshape it to what they want, because we can both kind of, I think we can both admit, for example, our examples of polar opposites between Frank Castle, Punisher, and Superman are both moral characters. They're both very rigid in their codes, but at the same time, You know, if I were looking at somebody to praise, I'd praise Superman over Frank Castle because of the inherent goodness of his morals, right? Um, so it's a weird kind of flexibility, and I think that's a good segue to kind of talk about a little bit more fluid uh, moral compasses of comic book characters. And you brought up a couple good examples when we were brainstorming last night, Boom. So how would you frame the idea of a more fluid, a more flexible moral compass in relation to comic book characters?
Well, these are characters who uh, often I think the common the common vernacular is to call them anti-heroes. They they try to ride that fine line. They're perceived as perhaps being more cool because they get to be bad guys and good guys, and the writers conveniently switch their moral compass uh, to suit the story. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. And obviously the characters like, I mean, example would be Lex Luthor. I mean, how many times, Lex Luthor, he does a lot of good, and then he'll turn around and he'll, 1 minute it would be Superman. He'll have an S on his chest and wear a suit of armor. And then the next minute he'll be Apex Lex and he wants to destroy, take over the multiverse with Perpetua. I mean, this flexible moral code that always evolves according to what the storyline requires. That it's interesting, and I think it does. I think if it's done wrong, it can give the impression of lazy storytelling, because in my view, there's nothing worse than if the character isn't doing what you need him to do, you're going to force the character to do something that doesn't make sense given their established moral compass. Right. I mean, if suddenly Frank Castle decided not to put a bullet through the head of a mafia figure and walk away, well, we would need an explanation for that, because that doesn't make sense. Frank Castle kills mafia guys. You know what I mean? That's a simple oversimplistic example, but that, Doctor Doom, I think Hawkman, Green Arrow, I think Hal Jordan, Iron Man has Thor, David Banner Hulk, Immortal Hulk in particular, has this moral compass is all over the place. And I think, again, there's lots of characters. I think more Marvel characters than traditional DC characters have that flexibility built in. And I think generally, if it's done right, it leads to more interesting stories.
No, I think you're right. And there's an emphasis on whether or not it's done right. You brought up Lex in particular, which I think is an interesting topic, because his shifting in moral compass, for me, at least in the case of Snyder's Justice League, felt really inorganic. Really, really inorganic, because I think that we had just kind of started hitting the real payoffs of Super Lex, like the good Lex, and then kind of without any real trigger, he makes the shift. And I would make an argument in that specific situation that it was on account of poor writing, on an account of Snyder and whoever to force Lex into a very specific position that they needed him to be in, rather than organically put him there. Because in my perspective, I feel like Jeff Johns did a really good job in Forever Evil moving forward in challenging Lex and challenging his moral code and his distaste for Superman, for example, and making him a character who is capable of doing great good, and then Snyder came along. So I don't know. And it's interesting, because I think a lot of the time that the morally fluid characters can be some of the most compelling characters in comic books, because you can really see or get a sense of struggle, of internal struggle, more than most characters through them. And it's frustrating when you have moments where, Lex is now kind of defined a little bit more fluidly, strictly because of a case of, frankly, poor writing. I don't know. Is it just me? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that I do think that at the beginning, in the transition from the good guy Lex Luthor with the armor with the S on it into Apex Lex, if I actually thought that transition, I thought that was, I won't say super well done, but I found it believable because initially, and people might forget this, but initially Lex Luthor in the pages of Justice League ended up going to the future, and he saw a future where he was sort of like the president of the world, and he saw a good future for humanity, and he was part of it, and it reinforced his narcissism. But I think it was consistent with his moral compass, because even when he was a good guy, he was an extreme narcissist, and but in his own way, if he's got one consistent trait in his moral compass, is that he puts humanity first. He just happens to put himself as the head of humanity, but he does put humanity above superhumans and him as the leader of humanity. So there's both a good and a bad to that. And I think that his initial evolution into what would become Apex Lex, I thought that was consistent. Unfortunately, he kind of went insane a little bit, I think, when he became Apex Lex, and then they tried to undo it. And then Bendis ignored his Apex Lex transition and then wrote him as a businessman while he was still Apex Lex. And I think editorially, I think there was a lot of problems. And now they've brought him back to being a businessman Lex. And here's the quick point that I think is relevant. When you have a character like Lex Luthor that has a very well-established moral compass, one of the good things that can happen is that when you happen to screw the character up, and arguably the Justice League storyline screwed up the Apex Lex character, and it didn't really resonate with as many fans as it could have, you can always go back. You can go back to what that moral compass was. So sometimes the moral compass actually saved, people go back to the comfort zone. They tried changing it. They tried evolving Lex they tried changing his moral compass a little bit, so it didn't exactly point completely north. Didn't work, so then they go back. So one good thing about when you have an established character with an established moral compass, if you're going to take the chance to evolve it and maybe change the character's belief system, because it is possible to change what a character believes and get them to change how they act on that belief, and therefore change the moral compass. You can get a character to change their mind. I mean, look at Toyman with Bendis, becoming reformed or redeemed. Characters redeem themselves, and a redemption arc is a classic case of a moral compass being evolved into something different. Redemption arcs are quite common, but you always got to be careful with how you do it. And of course, the jury ultimately is the readership as to whether or not it succeeds.
Here's the thing with Lex specifically, though, is I think even if you take it pre-Apex Lex, because I was pretty out of it by then, or before I go into this in-depth thing, quick hello to Tehillim and 29 and Tevya Smoka for joining us in the chat. Welcome.
Hey guys.
Sorry, I wanted to credit them real quick before I go into this. I think that they botched the whole shift in Lex's moral compass way before Apex Lex. I literally think that issue 1 of Justice League, spoilers for a story that's like 2 years old, when he beats Vandal Savage's head in and presumably kills him, I thought that was botched. There was no transition there. I mean, you get a little bit of a moral struggle and no justice for him, and he has that interesting interaction with Martian Manhunter that shows some sort of redefinition of Lex Luthor. And then the next thing we know, he is a ravenous murderer again, which I don't like. How do you go from being one of the saviors of Metropolis, saving people's lives, being a member of the Justice League, to beating someone's head in with a doorknob? I don't get it. There was, to me, there was nothing there that screamed authentic. There was no inciting incident that would warrant that quick of a transition back to homicidal maniac.
Well, I think I was going to say, you make a good point, and and really, there's no, you could be right. I think it's as I said, it's up to the reader to decide whether or not they buy that or not. And I don't disagree with you. Lex Luthor has certainly killed before. He's killed women before. He's a misogynist. He's an ass. He's a jerk. He's a narcissist. Lex Luthor's moral compass has certainly changed over the decades, and at a minimum, it's evolved. I don't disagree with you that there was something that perhaps in the transition it was maybe jumpy there. The example you gave of Vandal Savage, I mean, it was a fellow villain. It was done for shock value. Maybe it was forced, but I'm going to challenge you with a question though. How come Lex Luthor would do acts like that, and you think Lex Luthor is maybe acting a little bit out of character to his moral compass, and yet the Joker can do whatever the hell he wants? If the Joker doesn't kill somebody, oh, he's the Joker. If the Joker wipes out an entire crowd, oh, he's acting within his moral compass. The Joker seems to get away with all kinds of random craziness or even uncraziness, and the readership seems to be so forgiving, and that's the Joker. But Lex Luthor, not so much. And just a quick segue, and I know I'm sort of cheating a little bit here, but the Joker is the other category of the moral compass. He's, in my view, the undefined moral compass. I put Joker in the category of an undefined moral compass, which in my view is one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of the Joker. But in my view, I call him, if you have a fluid moral compass like the Joker, then that character, namely the Joker, is good to use, because the Joker is used as a foil for other characters because it makes other characters interesting. It makes Batman interesting when you use that type of character. But in any event, I'll put it back to you. Why would you forgive Scott Snyder's Joker, which was very different than Grant Morrison's Joker, which was different than Frank Miller's Joker? Why are you so forgiving of that transition in Joker during Snyder's run, but you're not going to forgive Snyder's Lex Luthor?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's honestly a very simple answer, and it's that Joker's history is predicated on madness for the sake of madness. Even in runs prior, Joker has explicitly been credited for assuming whatever personality type he feels compelled to assume. That's how you can justify the comedian and the mass murderer and all. I hate this static. That's how you can justify all of those different varieties of Joker, because he assumes whatever personality he feels compelled to assume at the time. It's been established. Lex Luthor is not that character. It takes, in my eye, based on what we've seen from Lex, at least in more modern history of the character, that there needs to be some sort of impactful event to create a massive shift of Lex's character. And even when Lex became a hero, it was kind of gradual, right? Forever Evil, he did it out of to serve himself. He was in danger. And what happened? Excuse me. Through the course of, for example, Jeff Jones' Justice League, we see him kind of relapse back into the villain in Darkseid War. And then during Dan Jurgens' Rebirth Action Comics run, we start to see him battle with those negative tendencies to become a moral character. And there was an organic flow for the character to progress and to establish a I wouldn't say a new moral compass, but a shift in his moral compass. And then all of a sudden, he beats Vandal Savage's head in with a doorknob because he has a little existential crisis. It feels like, I don't know if you guys are getting that static I just got. Are you getting that?
Yeah, static's really bad on my end. It's the worst it's been in a while. I don't know what's
Yeah.
I maybe when I'm talking, do you just hear static when I talk?
Right now, yeah, I'm hearing almost all static.
I can try going in, and I can try going out and back in on my computer like it was last night. That might be better.
Are you on your phone now?
Yeah.
Huh. Are you? Because okay, yeah, give it a shot.
Yeah, I'll just go in and out, entertain them.
Sure, I
And I'll
will.
come in and out again.
Yeah, of course. All right. So first of all, welcome some Okie dude to the chat. And where I was pretty much going with this in regards to Comic Boom's question about why I'm okay with Joker kind of serving multiple roles and being able to be represented differently through different runs is versus Lex is because again the Joker has been defined throughout comic book history at being the character that he feels the need to be to accomplish whatever type of desire, whatever type of ends he feels like he needs to meet. Whereas Lex requires a substantial event to shift his conscience. And even throughout his development into becoming Super Lex in the Rebirth run, he was still making an organic transition. Let's see. We got you back.
Yeah, hopefully this will be a little bit better.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, so I was just continuing to discuss the answer to the question that you gave me, but largely I think it dwells in the fact that with Lex you look at his transition to being good. It was fluid, it was organic, there was a relapse. It showed a genuine trajectory for the character to move in that is impacted by a series of events, and even to various degrees he has instances of relapse, but he makes that moral shift. Whereas in Scott Snyder's case, he goes from the pinnacle of his goodness to having a conversation with Martian Manhunter, which one would assume would adjust his moral compass slightly because of that kind of existential crisis he goes through. And then the next thing we know, like I said, he's beating Vandal Savage's head in with a doorknob. So I think there's a question of Lex in particular and how you can organically make those changes, because they can't just be made on the grounds that he is a little bit more morally flexible, right? Because I think that by making the point that he's morally flexible, it doesn't necessarily mean that he can just be influenced on the drop of a dime. It still requires kind of a push to make him assume those different roles. Whereas the Joker, he is whatever Joker he needs to be in whatever event he has to be. He said it explicitly. Grant Morrison has given numerous analyses on the character of the Joker, where he says that Joker, his state of insanity, or even in certain cases his state of super sanity, allows his personality to kind of evolve, right, depending on the situation.
Yeah. And I don't honestly, the Joker is a character that continues to baffle me. I don't understand why the character is as popular as it is. I actually I don't particularly like the Joker. I think he's a character that I don't honestly. I truly believe that you could replace any Joker story you pick any Batman run where Joker's been the bad guy. You can replace the Joker with a completely new character, and you would have just an equally compelling story. Because you could just, replace it with another psychopath. And it would, to me, the Joker is an analog for psychopathy. And I think because he's maybe the first and the most famous that he gets away with it. But I think I think when writers go to the Joker, I think it's late, I think it's lazy storytelling. I think it's a cop out.
I mean, sure. Here, let me challenge you on a couple things. Because I do agree that some writers do lazily pull the Joker card, and it's annoying because to some capacity, I think the Joker is best used sparingly. But I think that's only because the Joker is a delicacy. I think the Joker is a great character, and I think he, in some ways, I think you're right, because he does bring a lot of greatness out of other characters. But it isn't the only purpose he serves. He serves even looking at him as a severe contrast to the icons that we follow within the pages of comic book superhero stories. He is the ultimate evil for the sake of evil. There is no true motive except to be evil. And the reason why I think it gets tiresome is because you can't explore any aspect of humanity through Joker because the Joker has none. And it isn't necessarily a quality, a character trait that you can provide like stories with longevity over, because you can't develop anything. But when used correctly and sparingly, the Joker serves as a perfect articulation to not only define his opposing character, but to provide whatever level of conflict you need for your story. He's a very, very versatile character. But I think that there's definitely something to be said about how some writers use him as a get out of jail free card when they need to sell a couple of extra books because of the name. I'll give you that. But I don't think that it is overall a reflection on the quality of the character himself.
Yeah.
Because he serves a tremendous role as a comic book supervillain, not just because he was the first kind of major madman, but because of how inherently black that character is, how much of an abyss that character is, because there's no conflict internally for him in what he's doing. And in fact, the notion that we don't get a sense of his reflection or his internal thought process is all that more scary. I mean, you can't tell me that you weren't scared out of your fucking mind in what was it, Endgame, when he comes out of Jim Gordon's bed and Jim Gordon's on the phone. He's like, I did it. I killed him. And he stands back up. And you're like, holy shit. You feel so, it's such a cold moment. There's no thought. There's just a maniac sitting there pulling an axe out of his chest. And it is hysterically scary.
Yeah, as I said, I still say that the attraction of the Joker as a character is what he brings out in other characters, and he's such a popular character. He sells comic books. Why create a new psychopath when you can use the Joker and change his behavior all he wants? And by the way, my criticism of the Joker as an evolving character goes beyond just the fact that of his moral compass. They also change his intelligence level. He's now a super genius, just like Batman. He's now he's immortal. I mean, they keep upping the ante, and I suppose one could say that they've done the same thing to Batman too. Batman never used to be the second smartest person in the DC universe. Now he's the second, which I think is nonsense. I don't think Batman should be even in the top 1,000 of most intelligent people on DC universe, let alone the second. So I think that's a mistake. So I don't want to digress too much from that, other than to say that the Joker works. The Joker does work, I think, for me more as a foil character, and he does seem to get away with more. And I find it interesting that other characters, whether it's like if you were to take a character like the Cheetah in Wonder Woman, you really should become familiar with her background, because one writer might write her as a friend to Diana, and another writer might write her as an enemy. Well, you really got to get to know the character to know that it's more complex than that. So you actually have to know something about the Cheetah to write her, to truly understand her, to know what her behavior would be. Less so with the Joker, because to quote Michael Caine in Batman, the Batman movie there, with whatever it was, Dark Knight Rises, the Joker just likes to watch the world burn, and he's one of those characters. And when you have a moral compass that can be anything to anybody, it's a fantastic character, let's face it, because it allows it. Something about the Joker, there's something about darkness that inspires humanity to write great stories, and doesn't matter how depressing or dark they are. If that moral compass is dark and depressing and miserable and involves murder and mayhem, people just seem to love it and buy more comic books.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly there's something to be said about just the way characters as icons serve as machines to print money. I mean, let's look at you look at the early Image days. A lot of that stuff is garbage, but they made characters that were iconic and they grabbed people's eyes, and it was one of the most successful kind of eras in comic books. And especially to do that as an independent brand is huge. So I think by that same virtue, big two publishers do the same thing. I mean, that's why you have 8 Batman books at any given time and 5 Spider-Man books over at Marvel at any given time. Regarding like the intelligence of these characters, I don't think Batman would be nearly as interesting if he weren't arguably the smartest person in the DC universe. He wouldn't be a member of the Trinity. He wouldn't be nearly as important. I think it's a defining character trait. And I think there are also different levels of intelligence that you can kind of pursue, because he is kind of the best balance of technological intelligence and the nature to problem solve, obviously being the world's greatest detective. So I think it serves the character and his stories in many different ways. And regarding kind of folks shifting characters' intelligences by the nature of the stories, sometimes it is a product of mistake and poor writing, and writers just kind of trying to push their own agendas for characters. And at other times, they're just natural developments that characters need to make. Superman used to be an asshole in the Golden Age, and now he's the spitting opposite of an asshole.
Here's why I think that I think what Marvel has succeeded at more than DC has, generally, and I'm speaking very generally, but I think Marvel has succeeded more than DC over the years because their characters their moral compasses are all differently aligned and they're more distinguishable. Every member of the Justice League, virtually every member of the Justice League, with the possible exception of Hawkman, they pretty much agree on the same thing. They're all, they would act the same way in any given situation. They would react the same. They would propose the same. They would resolve the problem the same. The only difference is maybe Batman would obsess about it over a little bit more. And I don't think the differences between the Justice League members has been explored enough. And I use that example of Infinite Crisis, where they had the breakup of the Trinity. That was never adequately explored. I think that Wonder Woman I think Wonder Woman's moral compass is not necessarily pointing north. Maybe on Paradise Island, it's pointing a little bit different. She's from an island of 3,000 women, isolated from humanity for 3,000 years. I don't care what anybody says. She comes to man's world. No, she's going to think a little differently in terms of justice and how she approaches problems. I don't think that's adequately explored. Batman, he witnessed his parents being murdered. He taught himself martial arts and he was a genius. Something must have happened to Batman for him choose not to kill. The fact that he wouldn't kill, I don't buy it. He's going to have some. That story, I think, has yet to be told. Superman. Again, right now they seem to be generic copies of each other, and DC's biggest mistake is that they always seek to tell stories where the Justice League find what binds them together. Even Scott Snyder's long 39-issue story in Justice League, the Justice League has stood together, and it wasn't the Justice League. Their moral compass has always been north, but the citizens of the DC universe failed the Justice League because they failed to be inspired by what the Justice League is. But the Justice League, they're perfect. There's no dissension. There was no breakup. There was no difference of opinion. They're fighting for the sanctity of the multiverse, and they never once had an argument on how to fix it. Not really. That is boring storytelling. When you have your major characters and they all have pretty much the same moral compass, they're all pointing in the same direction. Where's the drama in that? And I'm just saying that this matters. And I think that if you really isolated and thought hard about how that moral compass should be, I think that would lead to better storytelling. And I think that Often that's not the case. People write a superhero and they just automatically assume, they ask themselves, well, what would I do? Because I think I'm a super guy. What would I do? That's not the question to ask. Look at the character's history and know that it's not you. It's this character that's gone through something different than you, right? And unfortunately, that's not how they write stories anymore. And you can really tell when a writer's doing that, because it's usually the bad stories.
Yeah. No, you make an interesting point. I think in some regards, I agree largely with the more modern example of Snyder's kind of misexecution of conflict within the grounds of the Justice League. However, I think that Batman, you discuss the rationale behind his moral compass. I think it's sound. I think it's there. And I think that's what makes him flawed. I think his morality is obviously one of his own weaknesses, And aside from that, it serves in so many different ways to bring him down, because Batman lives on an ideal, and people can't live on ideals. People can't operate on ideals. And in ways, it makes Batman better than us, that he does, but it is also to his detriment, because I think that it's what allows good writers to challenge his moral code and to really put that up to the test. I'm not saying this entire story is gold, but the moment in Hush where Batman is within seconds away from murdering the Joker, you're convinced that he could do it, I think. And he's only stopped by Jim Gordon to allow him to realign himself. And he is challenged. Do you know why? Because Batman chooses to base his entire moral compass on an ideal. And that's impossible. You can't do it. So I think that regarding Batman, I think there's a justification for it. There is something to be said, however, for Wonder Woman in particular, because, as you said, she was raised for thousands of years on an isolated island filled with mystical Mediterranean women. Who are you to be man's protector when you don't know man? And frankly, I think that would be a great question to ask in exploring a Wonder Woman story. I think it's worth challenging, for sure. But I think you make a point about Snyder's Justice League run, because he focused so much on coming up with physical conflicts that were so large. It didn't give him, first of all, he didn't even really take the time to resolve any of those conflicts. Right. And with that being said, he certainly didn't have the time to generate conflicts between each of the members of the Justice League.
Yeah, it was plot heavy. It was plot heavy, not enough character development in my mind.
It was plot heavy, and it wasn't even good plot. I said it.
Well, I thought I didn't mind the plots. I thought the plots were creative. It needed a better balance, because Scott Snyder's a good writer. I just think that he got a little bit too passionate, and he bit off a little bit more than he could chew, and he's not been able to swallow all of it. Bad analogy, but
yeah, but there's something to be said about the lack of execution. Like, you can have good ideas. I've seen plenty of bad. And I'm not saying Snyder's a bad writer. We all know how much I love him. But execution is certainly a quality of good writing. Yeah. Ideas don't make the writer. The good writer is in the execution. Yeah. And with that being said, and based on your kind of criticism there, how do you feel about the kind of identity crisis era of DC Universe, with the kind of moral quandary between whether or not to lobotomize Dr. Light and by translation kind of rob Batman of his memory of the event? Do you feel like that was kind of a suitable conflict between those characters to have?
That's an excellent question, and it's the identity crisis is actually Dan Didio very specifically wanted identity crisis, and he wanted to create more compelling stories, more like Marvel, to be blunt. And those aren't my words. That's actually were his words in an interview at one point, because he saw sort of the more compelling storytelling that Marvel was doing, and Identity Crisis was a flow from that. And of course, that was written by Brad Meltzer. I loved Identity Crisis. I thought it was fantastic. It should have there should have been more consequences that resulted from it in the mainstream DC universe. There was some, I recall specifically some issues of Catwoman, subsequent issues of the Justice League that dealt with it. I dealt with a little bit in Batman, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I mean, they kind of ran an entire event off of it. I mean, the OMAC project was arguably a result of Batman feeling betrayed and losing trust in his team members. So he creates the artificial intelligence in the sky.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. Although, I would argue though that the real issue, I mean, was there really was no reason why, because there was a number of Justice Leaguers that still believe in mind wiping. And by the way, I believe in mind wiping. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. If you could mind wipe a villain, why the fuck wouldn't you? Of course you would. I would. I wouldn't even hesitate. You're not going to mind wipe the Joker. I think you're negligent. I think Batman's responsible for the deaths of Jokers, of the people that Joker kills if you don't mind wipe the Joker. You're not going to mind wipe. You're going to let the Joker continue on his insane rants, insane killings, and you're worried about mind wiping him? Please. Give me a break. Right. That was never adequately dealt with, and that wasn't. Now, I'm not saying I know what the answer is, but that's the beauty of it. I don't know what the answer is, but at least explore it.
I mean, I don't think there should be. I mean, personally, I think that it is a good. There you go. What a victory! I think it's a good story decision because, again, the reason that you have an issue with Batman not being able to have the level of follow through to mind wipe his villains or to execute his villains is strictly because he lives off of an ideal, and an ideal is flawed, and ideals aren't pragmatic. Henceforth, when he decides to act on those ideals, they might be technically just or righteous, but they're not pragmatic at all, and it creates story potential. I mean, and certainly there's definitely an issue with the tendency of big two publishers to kind of open up potential plot lines to explore characters' flaws, or even kind of cast's flaws, and not kind of exploring it further. That's certainly an issue, but there's still something to be said about what that implies to the character of Batman, right? Like for the future, because it is your complaints are all valid. They are morally valid complaints, but it serves to kind of allow Batman to continue in perpetuity and to fail to create story because he lives off of an ideal, because it's impractical. And you know, not to paraphrase from a book that I don't like, but Batman 50, the false wedding issue, makes a good point. Is that he's a blue-eyed boy with muscles and money. He is, because he's operating in an ideal, and he doesn't let himself let that go, and that is to his detriment at times. So
it is. I do think though that we need stories like Identity Crisis every now and then to challenge the sensibilities of the characters, and a moral compass is in many ways, it's not particularly interesting unless it's challenged.
Sure.
I mean, given his moral compass, how would Batman react to the knowledge that he was mind wiped so that he wouldn't recall that the other Justice Leaguers mind wiped Dr. Light and some other villains? I mean, you could kind of guess in that, and it flowed from, and Batman acted exactly as you would expect Batman to react. And so in that's why the reason why the story was good is that the characters actually acted as you expected them to. But I thought the far more interesting reactions wasn't Batman. Because Batman, we knew how Batman is going to react. Batman's always a dick. And Batman's a narcissistic prick in many ways. He's got a lot in common with Lex Luthor, I think in many ways. And I think he's in denial about it. He's obsessive. It's got to be his way or the highway. The fact of the matter is that the justification, I will debate anybody that a mind wipe is a great idea. It was a great idea. And if I did a storyline for DC, I would argue, to me, the Suicide Squad would be doing Amanda Waller should be doing mind wipes all the time. The government should be doing mind wipes all the time. Capital punishment should be reintroduced into New York State and execute the Joker. There should be all kinds of things that should be done. And if they really wanted to rock the boat, to really challenge the sensibilities of the characters, they should see it through. But they never did that, in my mind. And just like they never saw through the consequence of Wonder Woman snapping Maxwell Lord's neck. If Wonder Woman snapped Maxwell Lord's neck, there are in any given year in the DC universe, there's at least 2 or 3 Maxwell Lords in terms of threat level and power. So, I mean, why would you call Batman to, you can call Batman, but there are some threats that Batman can't solve. And there's a little bit of a Deus Ex Machina idea of how convenient that Batman always figures out a way for the Justice League to defeat them. Why not have Wonder Woman step up to the plate and maybe snap a neck once in a while? Or Batman, or even Superman is killed. Now, I realize that may not happen much anymore, but for other reasons, which frankly I do think identity politics and microaggressions and the corporate powers that be would never allow that to happen for a whole slew of reasons. And I think that's unfortunate. But you have the multiverse, and I would love to give Greg Rucka an alternate universe and say, okay, Wonder Woman, she likes to snap necks once in a while. Here's an entire world with Wonder Woman. Do whatever you want. Have fun. And just because we would get some fantastic stories, because right now in the DC universe, and this might be a topic for another day, but I think because of the corporateness of these characters, I think that they're always forced to go back and reset the status quo. They always have to undo it. So Batman, people forget that Wonder Woman killed somebody. Do you think it would be possible? Do you think there's ever going to be a storyline where Wonder Woman now with Gal Gadot as with the super powerful $1 billion movie? You think they're ever going to have Wonder Woman kill anybody in comic books ever again? Never going to happen. Never going to happen. And if they do it, they're going to undo it right away, because the last thing they want to do is have their paragon of virtue and supplication actually snap somebody's neck. No, they're not even going to they're not even going to challenge her. They're not even going to challenge Wonder Woman's moral compass. We're going to get derivative storytelling, and they're always going to pull back at the last minute, and it's always going to be Wonder Woman that saves the day, and it's going to be other characters that have to do the dirty work. And that's another little writer's trick. They'll have Artemis, another Amazon, snap the person's neck, which will actually save the day, and then Wonder Woman will give a speech about how wrong it was or some such nonsense. And they have a convenient way of wrapping everything up, and they'll go out of their way to preserve the moral compass of some characters in a way that pisses me off, because they should let the character evolve and have Batman fail once in a while. Have Batman, give me a story of Batman sticking to his values and billions die because he's too goddamn stubborn to kill the Joker. Here's a news flash. In Injustice, Superman was right to rip Joker's heart out. There's nothing wrong with it. What's wrong with it? Conveniently, Tom Taylor had to write a story that if Superman became evil, the whole world would collapse. No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't. I don't think that for a second. Isn't it funny that we get so involved in these characters? You ever notice that Superman is so perfect that if they deviate from Superman, if Superman kills, well, then he must become evil. Their whole world's going to fall down. Jim Gordon actually believes that if Batman kills the Joker, that Batman's entire world and world structure is going to collapse. This is a guy that can come back from time, being lost in time at the end of Final Crisis with Darkseid, and he can battle his way back through time. But we're to believe that if Batman kills, he's going to totally collapse and become useless. Total nonsense.
I don't think he becomes useless or rendered inert. I mean, the character is obsessive. He has an obsessive personality. So I would definitely argue that it is a reasonable concern for Gordon to have that if Batman crosses that line, that he'd do it again. And then he'd do it again, and he'd do it again, and he'd do it again. Because he is by nature an obsessive character that lives on the virtue of an ideal, which is flawed, but on that same basis, that if he were to begin killing and to break the ideal, there wouldn't be any going back. I do think it's a logical concern to have about a character like that, strictly looking at Batman's psychosis, because his moral compass and his trajectory, he is so close to breaking that line. And the moment he does, it becomes easy. It becomes an easy thing for him to do. Now, I think that there are a number of different kind of potential outcomes for Batman killing one of his rogues gallery, and rightfully so, you know. But I still think that the concern is still reasonable. I still think that it presents a lot of really potentially dark outcomes just by nature of the fact that, let's be real, I mean, Batman isn't really the statue of mental health, right?
Well,
Like he albeit mentally fortuitous, once compromised, I don't think there's any going back.
all the more reason why, and just to build on a point when we talked last night, is when the best way to explore a moral compass like Batman's is to juxtapose it alongside Wonder Woman and Superman. How come Wonder Woman doesn't lose her moral compass when she snaps Maxwell Lord's neck?
Because she doesn't operate on an ideal. She operates on the sense of classical war pragmatism that she was educated on by the Amazons.
Well, I don't want to get tied up in definitions here. When you say Batman's fighting for an ideal, Batman has a belief system. Wonder Woman has her ideals. Superman, they all have their ideals. You can call them beliefs. You can call them ideals, or I don't know. We should maybe distinguish between ideology and beliefs or what have you. They all have their ideas and beliefs. The problem, the real question is who they are. Is their moral compass destroyed? I mean, because of one action.
I don't
think it is. And Wonder Woman's moral compass is, I think, or at least it was under Rucka back then, it was flexible. She could justify killing. You would have me believe, and clearly you're right under the current incarnation of Batman, that Batman can never contemplate a situation where he'd have to kill somebody. Ever. He just can't do it. He just can't do it because his whole world's going to collapse. Where's Jim Gordon? Batman's about to kill somebody. Oh my God, if he kills somebody, he's going to become the Batman who laughs. Come on. Like it's become a sad joke how much they won't let it go. Let him kill somebody once in a while. In all seriousness. And in fact, the most compelling, interesting characters of Batman are ones where he does let go. But why is it that if he kills, it's always the dark side? We have cops that kill. Cops shoot bad guys and kill them. People at the Gotham City Police Department end up killing hoodlums. They move on with their lives. They're law abiding. They're not all corrupt cops. Or their lives don't fall apart, but yet Batman's will.
It's because of his. And I'm not making this argument to kind of cite any rationality in his decision. The point is that he's not rational, right? And when I mean ideal, right? For example, there is an ideal that you are good to everybody. Most people, actually, nobody delivers on that ideal. It is an ideal for a reason, right? And nobody on this earth tortures themselves if they don't live by the ideal. Do they try to act on it? Yes, but it's not. There's no resolute conviction to being that person. And the thing that about Batman is he's entirely irrational because he does try to live on an ideal. Superman, for example, doesn't operate on ideals. He knows he can't save everybody. He tries to at times, but otherwise it would drive him insane. I mean, you go through a numerous arcs, for example, with Superman, where you get a sense of his sensory perception and how he hears hundreds of people in trouble literally at the same time, and he has to make decisions. He has to engage a level of pragmatism, and that allows him to be rational because he doesn't try to fight it. Wonder Woman, in the same vein, is probably the most pragmatic out of the entire Trinity. And the thing that makes Batman struggle so interesting is because he refuses to give up his ideal. And it's not rational. It's a character flaw. It's perfectly right to complain about it. But firstly, if Batman killed, there would literally be no point to Batman because his entire rogues gallery would be dead. So for the sake of keeping stories in perpetuity, there's no reason to. But you can justify it, and you can justify his conflict in not killing people because he's trying to live off of an impossible ideal. That's why you have those stories that challenge his ability to not kill, even if we would defend his honor if he killed somebody, right? Because it's not practical. Nobody hated, for example, in the first episode of Batman Beyond, when an old Bruce Wayne holds a gun to a criminal. Nobody faults him for it. Nobody would have faulted Batman and Hush for killing the Joker. But he would fault himself. And it's irrational. And it's a part of his character's psychosis that not only gives him the longevity of storytelling, but it presents him with a flaw that makes him interesting and readable. And the fact that folks like you and I are going to come back and be like, why did you do this? Is what's going to keep us reading. And
just to build on that, I agree. His compass is permanently Batman's moral compass, in a sense. It's always pointing north. In fact, it's pretty much broken. It's going to point north no matter what happens, even if in defense of leading into Infinite Crisis, when Wonder Woman snapped Maxwell Lord's neck, people may just to remind people, Batman kicked Wonder Woman out of the Batcave. Told her to get out. He gave her the silent treatment. Usually women do that to men. Batman gave Wonder Woman the silent treatment, told her to get out of the cave. I mean, he threw her, so he didn't, that was never resolved, by the way. That was never, ever dealt with. There was never that conversation between the two. That was never properly addressed. And this is but it was such a great story. Because you're asking yourself, well, how are these two going to act around each other? They're members of the Justice League. How do two people whose ideals, if you want to use your words, are so at odds now? How do they get along moving forward? That's what was unfortunately not, I think, addressed in a more substantive way. I know Greg Rucka wanted to address that, but unfortunately he ended up leaving DC on bad terms at the time before that could be fully explored. And I don't know what the hell happened editorially at DC, but that whole bloody thing was blundered. But
yeah, I mean, it's certainly it's an issue on editorial's behalf, and B, it's an issue on the writing staff's behalf, for sure. I think that would have been an interesting dynamic to explore between those two characters. And however, whatever the resolution was, I think the journey to it would have been really interesting, and it would have challenged the relationship between them.
And by the way, I think I know what the answer is. I think I know how that would have been resolved.
Sure.
I actually think that it would reach a point that at the end of whatever discussion they would have or adventure, that Batman loves Wonder Woman and his fellow heroes, and he respects them for precisely the reason that they exist. Because, to use your words, it is a flaw that he has. He's not perfect. And I know it's weird to say someone has a flaw and that they can't kill, but in many ways it is a flaw. If you need to kill somebody to save the planet, you better goddamn well have somebody around who's willing to do the killing.
Well, I mean, they are, and he said it on occasions. I mean, in Tower of Babel and in the adapted Justice League Doom film, they ask, what's your contingency for yourself? And it's them. They are Batman's contingency. And the thing is that Batman is so convicted in what he does, but to the same degree, he's so intelligent that he acknowledges his flaws, knows he can't act against them. So he generates a scenario where he knows somebody else will make the decision that he doesn't want to do. In the same vein, it's like Rorschach. Look at Rorschach's conviction at the end of Watchmen. Rorschach wants to die. And he knows that the only way his moral or his compass, he knows the only way his personality will let him die is if he goes down swinging.
Yeah.
So he puts himself in an impossible scenario where Dr. Manhattan has to kill him.
Yeah.
Because he won't do it himself. His resolve won't allow him. And it is very much that same nature. So I think you make a very, very good point about how Batman likely associates with folks like Wonder Woman and Superman who aren't like-minded.
Yeah.
Because they act as a counterbalance.
Right.
He kind of installs his own system of checks and balances.
I think that's right. And I think that quite frankly, I don't think we've had a story that has truly explained that. And at the risk of sounding egocentric, I think myself and you, and I think a lot of us readers who love the Justice League, I think we intuitively know this, but we've never really had a Justice League story that is made around this point home. Like Batman might resent Wonder Woman for killing, but he also in his heart of hearts knows that it has to be done sometimes. And if it has to be done, thank God Wonder Woman's around. Thank God Superman, even Superman will kill if he has to. Superman will, unlike Wonder Woman, Superman will cry for 3 weeks and, have a bunch of angst and cry into Lois's arms, but he'll do it. I mean, Superman himself killed 3 Kryptonian villains during John Byrne's run because they wiped out, he used gold kryptonite, took away their powers, then green kryptonite to kill him. So even Superman, the paragon of morality and good guys, he's not afraid to do what needs to be done. And it's interesting. It's very interesting that Batman, with his moral compass, that while he's the darkest out of all 3 of the Trinity, that he's the one that's least likely to kill.
Yeah, and so Gore Vidal poses a pretty good question, resolving the current kind of direction of our conversation. First of all, Gore Vidal, welcome to the stream and to the conversation. And he thinks the question is, are readers prepared to accept their heroes like Batman, Superman, and even Spider-Man killing their enemies? Would it be acceptable even if it's only one time? So based on the fact that, in this conversation, we've discussed some characters' willingness to compromise a sense of a no-kill rule, I'm going to assume we're talking about those 3 characters specifically. And you just brought up Superman. So I think that kind of puts 1X on the board here. Superman has killed before. And I think typically with Superman, if he can save somebody, he will. But if he knows it's out of his control, he knows it's out of his control. I think Batman and Spider-Man are particularly interesting. Because if I'm not mistaken, I mean, maybe it's just an Ultimate Spider-Man thing, but didn't Pete also kill Norman when he died? In Ultimate Spider-Man, didn't they kill each other?
I can't remember. You might be right. I'm not sure.
But either way, I mean, it's out of continuity, so it's not a spectacular mistake. I very much think that Spider-Man kind of operates on the same kind of moral trajectory as Superman. I think that if he can avoid killing at all costs, he will. But if he knows that it's his only option,
he'll do it.
He's prepared to do it.
I agree with you. And I have always thought of Peter Parker as someone who he feels Peter Parker needs to feel that he's done everything he possibly can to win the day without a loss of life. But if he wins the day and some life is lost, but he knows he's done everything he can to prevent it, he can live with that. Obviously, he's Peter Parker. He's going to feel bad for a while. I mean, who wouldn't? But I mean, he's going to be able to move on. He's going to be able to deal with it. And so it's a good question. Would it be acceptable? I would say arguably it wouldn't be acceptable insofar as their moral code. They would be challenged by it. It would be acceptable to the readership if there was a consequence from it.
Yeah.
Now, I don't agree with the consequence for Batman, and maybe we'll agree to disagree. in terms of, I don't think that Batman would necessarily hit rock bottom as Batman himself thinks he would, or Jim Gordon thinks he would. I also I will not assume and accept without evidence that that the moment you kill one person, it's a slippery slope and suddenly you're going to become a psychopath. I think that's nonsense. In fact, most people, certainly most police officers who kill, they don't become raging maniacs that, go and kill jaywalkers. I mean,
here's the thing though. Batman isn't most people. You're applying a general base logic to a character that is anything but general, right?
Well,
I mean, it is
enough. I think you're assuming that he's so different, though. But you're on the other extreme of my argument, saying, "Well, Batman is so different that he's the exception. That if he kills, well, that's just different because he's so different." I just don't think Batman is quite as different as, at least my conception of him. I don't see him as being as different as you do. I mean, he's super intelligent. He's the second smartest man in the DC universe. He can rationalize everything. He's a genius, but yet somehow I personally can't rationalize this super genius, super physical athlete being unable to handle having killed somebody. I just can't. Yeah, I have a difficult time with it. I appreciate your argument.
It's probably in the same way though that you couldn't imagine anybody good doing anything bad. I mean, it's if Batman didn't have that, what flaws would he have? That is his central flaw, right? I mean, you never want to imagine a flaw in people, or in this case, characters that you have affection towards to a degree. Like, you don't want to, sure, but it is a character flaw, right? I mean, because in any jurisdiction that we're talking about, these mythological characters for all intents and purposes, like you can make them perfect, but they wouldn't be readable. Like it's almost like, of course, his obsession is a double-edged sword, as most motivations are out there in the world. But I think that the sides of that double-edged sword, sorry, singular, are much more apparently impactful in the character. His obsession not only makes him one of the most resolute characters in the DC universe, who will give up body and soul to save somebody, but it's also to his detriment. He's willing to compromise everything else in his life in order to preserve that ideal. And it's a character flaw. I think for me, and I'm not like trying to psychoanalyze, but I feel like for me, I think the reason that you don't want to accept it is because you like the character and it is an inherent flaw in the character. But I don't think it's a flaw in the kind of projection of the character. It's not a characterization issue. It is just inherently something that sets the character up for conflict.
Well, it does indeed set the character up for conflict, but it's a very contrived and controlled conflict. Batman rarely, even in storylines, you ever notice this? Doesn't matter who writes the storyline, whether it's Snyder or Morrison, whatever the storyline, no matter what the enemy, Batman can fight the devil and he never kills anybody. He never has to kill anybody. Batman can be in the middle of a war. He doesn't have to kill anybody. He incapacitates everyone. You could throw Batman in the middle of Passchendaele in World War I. I'm sure he wouldn't kill anybody. He'd knock out his enemies. He'd knock out the Germans. No. I mean, it's very convenient, and I'm being a little bit facetious here when I'm playing a little bit unfair in my statements here, but just bear with me.
Sure.
What I would like to see is this. I would like a storyline, and I shouldn't give away these stories because I think this would be a great storyline. I would like to see a storyline where Batman perceives the threat and he detects the threat, and even with his genius, he's the second smartest man in the DC universe, that even Batman is compelled to acknowledge that there is no way the threat that is coming to Earth or to Gotham can be done without killing a lot of people.
It's been done.
Well, no. It's been conveniently resolved to avoid the deaths. I'm saying actually it will not, no matter how it's resolved, even with a win, there's going to be people there. Your enemies are going to die. You're going to have to kill them. How do you resolve it?
Well, I mean,
and that to me, no Duke Eck Machina ending, or suddenly you manage, Batman finds a way. Well, wait a minute. To really challenge a moral code, a moral center, what if you can't resolve it? Sometimes, I mean, the real test of a hero, I mean, look at, and I use Born Again as a prime example, where Daredevil utterly failed. He lost everything, and he still kept his faith. Or he lost it, but he found it again. And Batman, and Daredevil lost, like, and Karen Page, Karen Page was killed, and he, if you violate, how heroic is it if you violate your own moral code and you still manage to come back from that? Why doesn't Batman do that?
Here's the thing: is that the story that you're implying, we've seen it in Final Crisis. Batman aims to kill Darkseid. His intention is to kill Darkseid. And because of the nature of comics, sure, he didn't die, but for all intensive purposes, he makes the compromise under
you're right. That's a good answer. I would also say it's an extreme example. He's fighting a god. I'm talking about just straight up.
I think that's
a human story. Like he's fighting. I mean, Darkseid was a god, but
I think that's the only way you can challenge him. It's almost in the same way that we're talking about, Superman in particular, because Superman, you look at, for example, I think it was it's the storyline that they adapted from Superman in the Elite. He got destroyed and was literally thrown through fire and brimstone in order to save not only the world, but to prevent himself from killing the Elite.
Yeah.
And I think that for Batman in particular, because I think his will is even more indomitable than Superman, it is a literal metaphor for how rigid his moral compass is. It literally takes the what's the word I'm looking for? The interference of a god to get Batman to break his moral compass. And there's something to that. And I think that if you give Batman a street-based crime that he can't solve, it undermines the character, because I don't think there is a street-based crime that Batman couldn't solve. Sure, you could make it challenging, but in the end, it would undermine him in the same way that I thought it was fucking dumb that a chimpanzee became a master detective before Batman did. I get in ways what you're saying, but I think that the reason that Batman has stood as such an icon and a symbol in the way that he has is because of his unwillingness to compromise. And specifically using that example from Final Crisis, it literally took the intervention of a god. It literally took insurmountable odds to get him to crack his code. And then and only then could Batman do it without compromising his integrity. You know what I mean? I think it's largely like at the service of a very powerful metaphor here.
Right. And but I just want to point out that if you view Batman as having played a role in killing Darkseid in Final Crisis, I just want to point out the fact that it didn't adversely affect Batman at all, killing Darkseid. And as a matter of fact, he was at the top of his A game because after killing Darkseid, he had no problem doing the impossible by managing to return of Bruce Wayne. He managed to come back in all his full glory. So it didn't have any ill effects. So,
but that's what I was getting at, though, at the end of my statement there, that he was able to do it only under that circumstance, only under the literal circumstance of godly divine interference.
No,
is he able to compromise his code? Like the point is that anything else, any other event that a writer would try to use to make Batman compromise his moral compass would be beneath the character. And that would break him. Because I think internally, even Batman knows that there has to be a certain achievable plateau that is so beyond normal for their universe, even.
No, I get your point, and yes, that whole moment in Final Crisis, the reason why that moment was such a big deal is that, number one, Batman used a gun, and he said he'd never shoot a gun. He hates guns. He shot a gun, and number two, he had the intention to kill, no question, and it was a big moment, and it's because he doesn't kill. So there's no question that was, and the multiverse was at stake. And so Batman violated his own principles when it mattered the most. And he only did it to save all of the multiverse. And that's why it was a big moment. I grant you that. I also grant you, though, that I will say categorically that's because that's how the story was written. And I think it's very easy to imagine stakes that are considerably less than the death of the multiverse where Batman can't find a way out of it. That's all I'm saying. And at a minimum, not only do we never get a story where Batman might fail and end up killing somebody, but Batman always interferes with other people killing people for justifiable reasons. He interferes with police officers in the lawful performance of their duties, killing bad guys justifiably, at least in the eyes of the law. And this is my point, where what I would really like to see is, I would like to see Batman and Wonder Woman team up, where, I mean, guess what? There's a reason why the Wonder Woman doesn't have a villain like the Joker. They wouldn't last long.
Yeah.
They would last one adventure and it would be done. If Batman wants to go on vacation, next time he goes on vacation, let Wonder Woman take care of Gotham. Let Wonder Woman protect Gotham City for 2 weeks. By the time he gets back, that city's going to be cleaned out, and they're all going to, okay, I'm exaggerating here for effect, but I think there's something, at least the Wonder Woman under Rocca, that attitude is, if you can't cage it, if you got a person who's basically an animal and you can't cage it, and they can't be caged and they can't be stopped, then you kill it. It's justifiable, simple. Do the job, kill it, go about your business. I mean. And in any event, I would like to see that interaction. How does Batman reconcile? Batman, for example, he'll fight alongside Deadshot. He'll fight with the Suicide Squad. And of course, you fight along. It doesn't matter if you're a group of 10 or 15 or 1,000 people. If Batman's on your team, everybody's got to change the rules to conform to Batman. Okay, we've been killers our whole lives. We're in a war, but we have this new guy called Batman on our team. None of us can kill. So take all the bullets out of your gun, put the rubber bullets in, guys. We're not allowed to kill anymore. Everything's always around Batman. And I get it. He's the core character. But to challenge the character more, maybe making Batman less godlike, because if you really want to explore his humanity, by saying that he can't handle the test of his humanity by killing someone, then you're really making him godlike, because the stories are always twisted to fit around and justify him not killing.
Yeah, but I don't think that's a product of the character. That's just a product of writers and how writers choose to handle it.
So this is my point. So challenge it then. Challenge give Batman a scenario that he can't escape from. Test him.
But I think the point is, though, is that any situation beneath something like the caliber of what was going on in Final Crisis is kind of beneath the character. It's very much that same vein. It is literally like you literally have to bring him to the end of it all, right? And the reason something like Final Crisis works, and I've had this comment up for a while from Gore Vidal, and it's kind of speaks to what I'm saying here, is that he thinks that to make it palpable to the general reader that their heroes will kill their enemies when necessary, it would take a strong writer to reimagine them. And in the same sense that Grant Morrison is entirely cognizant that by that Batman doing what he's doing is a huge event.
Yeah.
Him and his resolution to kill Darkseid with the God Bullet, with the gun, is entirely like on the back of the metaphor that the only way Batman will justify it is if he literally has no other option. And because of the way the character has been set up, I don't really think that there is really anything you can do for much further down from a multiversal level event that would cause him to do that, because of how the character has been set up. I mean, he literally went to go fight the devil to revive his son. Well, and maybe there's an issue with the fact that the continuity is so widely stretching it, and it gives you too much to predicate his kind of instinct on. But
well, let me give you an example, building on what you're saying, and I can't believe you haven't mentioned this already, so I'm going to have to mention it. And I want to say Jalen Neely in the comments says that he blames Alan Moore, and I chuckled when I read that because, of course, Alan Moore, that's a reference to The Killing Joke. And in The Killing Joke, Batman, arguably by one interpretation, kills the Joker. And I want to talk about, because this is interesting, Damned, the series Damned, which is the quasi-sequel to The Killing Joke, where that series ends with that whole series written by Brian Azzarello was Batman feeling guilty for having killed the Joker.
Sure.
And at the end of it, he feels so guilty, he gives his soul up so that the Joker returns. That's how that ends.
Yeah.
And that's how guilty he felt about having killed the Joker. At least that's how I interpreted the story. And I don't think for a second that Batman would ever feel that guilty and do something so ridiculous as to give up his soul, nor do I think that John Constantine or any of the demons would come and claim Batman's soul like they did in that series. But I think that completely builds on your point, or at least it seems to me that's a story where.
Well, the reason I didn't use it as a basis for my argument is because it's out of continuity, and I think that it obviously provides creators with a lot more freedom with Elseworlds kind of style stories. So I didn't think. I mean, it is a good point, but for me, I tried to use specifically in continuity situations, just because I feel like that's the Batman we're talking about. Because Elseworld stories give these creators a potential to kind of remanipulate aspects of the character. If that story were to happen in continuity, I would surely have a couple of issues, especially because of some of the implications within it. But because it's Elseworlds,
well, it's perfectly consistent though with your understanding, or your premise is that if Batman kills, his entire world falls apart. And in fact, that's what happened in Batman Damned, because it addresses the hypothetical in a story. Okay, Batman he killed the Joker. Look at how much it destroys Batman. It destroys Batman's soul, and so much so that he gives up his soul even to the devil so that the Joker can return. So even his greatest enemy will return. Absolute total nonsense. I think
he in that, if you're using that story as an example, he gave up his soul way ahead of time to the Enchantress as a child.
Okay, I guess I would need to know the nuances of the story, but I mean, why did he give his soul up to the Enchantress as a child? For what purpose?
I think it was ultimately a symbolism to numb himself and to make himself to kind of make himself that symbol and that pinnacle of uncompromise and unfeeling and lack of emotion, so that he can become the ultimate warrior for all intents and purposes. Because if you look at, there are multiple scenes where you show images of a young Bruce Wayne's soul literally watching him. And the end of Batman Damned is the symbolic kind of necessity for Batman to retain his humanity and to regain it in order to be the best possible Batman he can be. Because throughout that story, he was clearly very flawed because he decided to give up his humanity, not because he sacrificed it for some greater good. So I mean, that's my interpretation. But again, I don't use that example because there's a lot to be said about just the notion of interpreting a little bit more, not esoteric, but a little bit less clear storytelling, because it's a weird paradox with the Killing Joke, because there is certainly the interpretation that Batman kills the Joker at the end of the story, but it's technically impossible because Batgirl, the trajectory of Barbara Gordon, makes the Killing Joke canon. And if the Killing Joke is canon, clearly the Joker exists long after the story. So even if it was Alan Moore's intent to kill the Joker, continuity kind of argues that he didn't. It would, because it is now in continuity, and if he had killed the Joker, then we wouldn't have had Joker in continuity, because Batgirl kind of felt the ramifications of that story for, God, what, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, easily.
So it's a difficult, I think it's just a really difficult example to make, albeit kind of the one that everybody looks at, to kind of look at that really hairline balance between Batman's moral to kill and not to kill. And it's, I mean, listen, clearly I think we're on two very different sides of that argument, because I think that the inherent value of Batman being the flawed character he is in the symbolism and that lack of the ability to compromise. And it is a little bit out there and it is unrealistic, but I think it kind of serves the greater atmosphere of the world that he lives in.
Right. I think I don't disagree with what you stated. You stated factually how writers approach Batman and how he's approached and how he's written and the reason why he's written that way. And I can't disagree with how Batman is written right now in terms of how you describe how he's written. I would just like to see it a little bit more. I would like to see more narrative attempts at challenging Batman's moral compass. I don't think it's been challenged enough.
Sure.
Don't. That's what I'd like to see. You can still have Batman win in the end, but challenge it a little bit more. And at the very least, let's see how Wonder Woman would react with it, or Superman. Like, really challenge them. And we got a hint of that with Identity Crisis and hints of that with the lead up to Infinite Crisis, but just not enough. And it's these teases that sort of I think make those teasing storytelling techniques make for the best stories.
I think I agree with you in that angle. I certainly think there's room to challenge the characters' moralities, because those conflicts are ultimately what generates the best story. Yeah. You know, we don't ever want to see these heroes come out of these events unscathed, because frankly, otherwise they're uninteresting, right? Challenging these characters is what provides you strong plot. It's what provides you great conflict and drama. So I agree with you. I think that certainly there is space for these characters to be challenged. And I think that it'll obviously depend on how the individual writer decides to challenge it. That'll kind of lead to credibility of the story and to the action of challenging the character's morals. But I agree with you. I agree with that sentiment. I think that that's how you generate the best story. And Tevye Smoka asks, what about Wally West, the Flash, and Heroes in Crisis? I mean, you know, that was probably the least organic thing you could possibly ever do in comics.
Yeah, there was no build up to what Wally West did in Heroes in Crisis. Although, let me try to defend it a bit. Let me try to, because I don't like the story because I like Wally West. But if this was any other character other than Wally West, whose moral compass we thought we knew, if this was any other character, I mean, one could say, what Wally West did in Heroes in Crisis, and just to recap, spoiler alert for those who don't know, he lost control. He was psychologically compromised because he's lost his wife Linda and his twin children somewhere in time, or they technically don't exist anymore because of the nature of the multiverse. and he's the only one that remembers them. He thinks maybe he's gone insane. No one's really helping them find them. Barry Allen has betrayed him, et cetera, et cetera. I think he has. Anyways, Wally West is all depressed. And then while he's dealing with that depression that results in Sanctuary, he loses control of the Speed Force. And the Speed Force lashes out and kills everyone in the Sanctuary. And, well, that's what happens. Now, in that regard, I would say to Tevye, one could argue that that has nothing to do with his moral compass per se, necessarily. If he had a mental illness, if he got depressed, and it was an accident, or he lost control of his powers, that's not necessarily something he did intentionally as a result of a change in his moral focus. So you could defend the story that way by saying, well, it was a conflagration of events, albeit very forced, but nonetheless out of the character's control. And so you could avoid stating that it was a deviation or a degradation of his moral compass. Having said that, I would, though, Wally West, we don't like that. I have a hard time believing that he would have lost that degree of control, and I don't think he would ever have. I don't see that event having played out the way it was. I did feel it was very forced. What about you?
Didn't he physically kill people with his bare hands? It wasn't like something happens, Speed Force lightning kills everybody, right?
He actually killed himself after. He killed no, he never killed anybody with his bare hands. Well, no, I thought it was just the lightning that did it. He never killed anyone intentionally.
I don't know. I've tried to block that. I've tried to block that story out of my mind. So I don't know.
He killed himself intentionally. Remember, he went forward in time to kill his future self. Or pardon me, he killed his future self and then brought his future body back in time. And
God, that story was so stupid.
Yeah, no, it was. But that does raise sort of an interesting point that I will say this about the storyline in Heroes in Crisis in relation to the context of what we're talking in terms of a moral compass. If somebody suffers from a mental illness, that's arguably, that's outside their control, arguably, not to get into the medical psychology of it, but if it's outside one's control, it's hard to blame them if they do something crazy because they're possessed or they're mentally ill through no fault of their own, or they suffer from depression. That's always going to have an impact on behavior and whereas normally you act on your beliefs and you have leading to your faith and your moral compass. Obviously, if you're suffering from a mental illness of some kind, that might have an impact on how you behave. And that whole thing with Wally West, I consider to be an aberration because he was clearly acting outside his moral compass. And when you deviate a character that far from their moral compass, there is often a elastic band reaction by the comic book company to undo the damage. And that's why we got Flash Forward. And that's why Wally West is the lead character going into what was 5G, but now we don't know what it's going to be.
That's the thing too, though. He kind of stood idly by and let Booster and Harley Quinn get framed for the murders. There's something to be said about that. There's something to be said with the fact that, if anybody wants to say he was busy doing blank, time is fucking relative and he can travel through it. So if he truly had any sense of his prior moral groundings, he could have provided evidence and save everybody from that whole conflict. It's such poor fucking writing.
Yeah.
And there are ways that I think with a lot of characters that you can challenge them and you can make them break their own moral code, but the writing needs to show for it. There needs to be an organic direction and organic flow to it. And it also 9 times out of 10 can't happen over the course of 2 or 3 issues.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there needs to be a blueprint for it, right?
Yeah.
Like you could probably make Wally West kill somebody, sure. Would it be in a random one shot with no expository information that would lead him to do it? Fuck no.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what it feels like, Tom King did. I mean, he took first of all, Josh Williamson butchered Wally West too in what he did in Flash War, and how he was willing to let Wally West compromise kind of the safety of the entire Earth Prime, of the entirety of Earth Prime for the sake of his kids. Like, I don't think that was a logical trajectory for the character either, and especially in how quick it happened. So, I mean, the entire mess with Wally West, I mean, it's a shame. It brings me great sadness because what was happening with Wally in Titans pre all of that garbage was actually pretty good. I really enjoyed what was going on there, how he was kind of granted the mantle of Flash alongside Barry rather than feeling undermined.
Yeah.
And then, all of that happens. The thing is most of the time, I feel like you can do nearly anything with these characters as long as the writing is there to back it up. And most of the time, it's not.
Yeah, and I just want to add, like, to bring the focus back to the distinctions, the three distinctions we made. We got the moral characters with moral compasses that are rigid, more set in stone. We got the flexible moral compass, and we have the sort of the undefined, like the Joker, that they can get away with pretty much anything. And with the Flash, because Flash has more of an established rigid moral code, if you suddenly change it, and if you suddenly have him do something and there's no setup for it or justification for it, it's difficult. Like, for example, if the Red Hood, if what happened to Wally West, if it had been Red Hood at the Sanctuary, it would have been it still might have been difficult, but it would have been an easier sell than Wally West, because the Red Hood's moral compass, well, we know Red Hood is killed before. And no, you know what I mean? Like, he's a little bit more, again, I know it still wouldn't fly, but you get my point. Like, the more flexible that moral compass, you got to be careful. If I was, as a reader, and I know I'm not a writer, but if somebody wanted to write a comic book, and I as a reader was giving them advice, I would, write in my mind, writing 101 for dummies from a reader to a writer, I would say to them, what's the moral compass of the characters you're writing? First and foremost, if you can't describe to me what the moral compass is of your characters, then you got a problem. Because remember that a moral compass is premised upon what that character thinks is right and wrong and how they act on it. And if you don't know the answer to that, if you can't ask yourself the question, okay, I've just created this character, how would this character react in this situation? If you can't answer that question like that, you need to focus, you need to work more on that character, because you need to have a grounding. And the great thing is that when you have different characters with different moral compasses and they're all reacting to the same event, that's what creates the drama, because you're going to get different reactions. And you can only get that drama if you know the moral compasses of those characters. And if one is rigid, one is flexible, and one is undefined, that's what makes the quality of the story. And if the readers know the moral compass or have some sense of it, they're going to have a better rapport with the story, better rapport with the characters, and you're going to have a successful event.
I 100% agree with you. The thing is that a lot of these writers they either don't know or they don't care to abide by predicated kind of characterization regarding morality. And when they decide to make these decisions and fans have to sit there and try to come up with excuses out of their ass, it just goes to show that the writing doesn't back it up.
That's right.
The thing is that if you're going to challenge characters' morality, you need to know what that morality is, and it needs to be challenged, not reverted, not mirrored, not nothing. I think it does go into semantics, but by definition, a lot of these writers, when they decide to make conflict for characters, they will take a character with a known kind of justification for their morality, and they'll just transform it. And it's not a gradual change. They just do it for the sake of story. And that's what makes stories like that fail. That's why Heroes in Crisis failed. That's why the end of Tom King's Batman run failed. Because none of it made sense. Aside from the fact that instead of even trying to make a gradual moral shift in trajectory, it was the character is going to be this now because I need it now. Not because there is an event at point B, C, and D that kind of elicited any sort of change in outward response to those scenarios.
I agree. We're gonna have to. I asked that we tie it down now because I gonna start binge watching with the wife. So
no, yeah, absolutely, yeah. We are definitely teetering on 2 hours here. We'll just address a couple of. We'll kind of close it out. Address a couple of folks in the chat here. Let's see. Yeah, Tavia, I don't think Dan DiDio hated all of DC Comics, which is kind of what you're getting at here, bud. He definitely has expressed a distaste for Nightwing, but
yeah,
the way you're going here is that Dan DiDio hates DC, and he's the problem with everything at DC, and I don't think that's the case.
Well, Dan DiDio is no longer there, so I know Tevye is happy about that, and I know Tevye. Shout out to Tevye. I know that he's still traumatized by the aging up of John Kent. I'm also dealing with the trauma of having to deal with an older John Kent. Bring back the Super Sons.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Dan DiDio is definitely at fault because he has allowed some of these changes. He's allowed Tom King to do what he did to Wally in Heroes in Crisis. But I don't think, he approached Tom King and said, "Hey, Tom, make Wally a psychopath." I don't. But he does share some of the blame. Gore Vidal also says, Ed Brubaker has the temperament and creativity to redefine Batman or any A-level hero in this manner. It can be done, but it must be thought out and convincing. A character's history is important. I agree with pretty much everything you're saying here, Gore Vidal. I've been arguing on pretty much every stream that we cast Batman writers that Ed Brubaker, especially with the experience that he's garnered over the years of doing all of his independent crime comics and novels, that he would be, I think his Batman run now, if he were to have one, would be infinitely better than his original Batman run, just because of how he's developed as a writer. I don't know if I would give him any character. I mean, just the fact that I trust him as a writer, I would, but I think there are other characters that I would have ideally more suitable writers. But I would give him the benefit of the doubt for sure.
And incidentally, just a comment on Ed Brubaker. I think Ed Brubaker probably, when him and Greg Rucka on Gotham Central, that series, you want to talk about characters with different moral compasses. That is probably one of the best series you can read about if you want to explore characters with different moral compasses. The different police officers of Renee Montoya, Jim Corrigan, Harvey Bullock of Gotham Central. The way Ed Brubaker and Greg Rucka explored those characters and the nuances of their respective moral compasses was just fantastic. Fantastic. So much so that you didn't need Batman in that. In fact, Batman almost never appeared other than in shadow from occasionally in that series. But an excellent example of if you good storytelling, not all stories that take place in Gotham require the Batman to show up.
You're right. I mean, Gotham has an eclectic cast in and of itself. Outside of Batman, that clearly generate great story under the hands of great writers like Ed Brubaker. And the end of Gore Vidal's comment here, a character's history is important, and that's entirely right. There is a very fine balance that creators need to take in charting new paths for these characters, but it needs to kind of be a result of a trajectory based on what we know about them already and all of the pre-existing history. So you're 100% right. And this was a good discussion. And that is thanks to, of course, Comic Boom, my partner in crime, and all of you wonderful people who joined us in the live chat, giving us your examples, your thoughts on this discussion. So we couldn't have done it without you guys, and we appreciate you. So big thanks to Joe's Geek Show, Tehillim 29, Tevya Smoka, Some Okie Dude, Gore Vidal, Brevin Campbell, Jalen Neely, and I think I got everybody. But we wouldn't have been able to have such a great conversation without you guys. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you haven't already, please make sure to like this video if you enjoyed it. That helps us out a ton. Small YouTubers need all of the algorithm love we can get. And with that being said, please also make sure to subscribe to myself and Comic Boom, this guy, using the link in the description below. He puts out some of the most stimulating and interesting reviews out there in comics. He just put out a review on an independent graphic novel called Soul Finder, right? Soul Finder?
Yeah, Soul Finder, yeah. Demons.
It was excellent. I didn't even read the book, and he made me want to read the book. So, Comic Boom, do you have any content coming out in the near future you want to let the folks know about?
A shout out to Tevya. I'm a member of the Fortress of Attitude. We review Super Sons there every week. So Tevya with Tehillim. It's on Tehillim 29's YouTube channel. We get together every week. I think that'll be tomorrow at around 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, pardon me. I think it's 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. In any event, it's we talk everything Super Sons. So people, if you're interested, you can check that out. As for what I got coming out, I do want to have a discussion on God Country with you, and maybe even get other people involved too. Maybe even Comic Show if he's read it. But I know that I will be reviewing Donny Cates' God Country. I think that is absolutely riddled with themes. And you want to talk about a moral compass? Oh my Lord, that's we could use that story in and of itself to really explore that angle of it. But in any event, yeah, I'll just thank you for having me on again. And, until next time.
Absolutely. Anytime. Make sure you guys follow us both on Twitter. We have our Twitter tags scrolling below here. And let us know, is there any topic that you want to see the two of us discuss or perhaps even debate? Feel free to hit us up and tag us in the posts. So again, thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you on the next episode of Let's Talk Comics. This is going to be the indomitable Dark Knight Nation and Comic Boom signing out. Thank you guys again.
See you guys.